Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity was added in the Hotel Plus update. This update introduced many new entities to the game, 10 in total, and this entity is one of them. Your second hint is that this entity actually becomes stronger the further you progress in the game. They become stronger when you pass the infirmary room, and even stronger after the second Seek chase. Your third hint is that this entity can spawn in almost any room. Some entities, such as Figure, can only spawn in specific rooms. However, this entity is free to appear almost anywhere it wants. Your fourth hint is that a crucifix can be used on this entity. All this will do is prevent the entity from dealing any damage to you, so I would say it's kind of a waste of a crucifix. Your final hint is that this entity almost exclusively spawns while you are playing with other people. However, as long as you're smart, it can be easily avoided. Have you figured out what this entity was? It's Void. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity isn't guaranteed to spawn during a normal playthrough of the game. Some entities, such as Glitch, can't be experienced unless a certain rare event occurs. Your second hint is that the longer you stay with this entity, the more amplified the music will become in order to build suspense. At least to my knowledge, this is the only entity with this trait. Your third hint is that this entity actually appears in the buddy system badge icon, although they are very hard to see if you aren't looking in the correct place. Your fourth hint is that this entity was previously called Shade. However, later in development, their name was changed to the one many of you are familiar with. Your final hint is that this entity is typically associated with the color blue. Could you guess which entity this was? It's Halt. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity is one of the most common in the entire game. In fact, I'd argue it is almost as common as Hide, which is an entity which appears in almost every single room. Your second hint is that this entity functions very similarly to another entity in the game. Something similarly to this would be how the Lookman functions almost the same as eyes. Your third hint is that dying to this entity causes you, the player, to have a unique animation. Typically, whenever an entity such as Figure kills you, the entity itself has an animation or jump scare, but in this case it is the other way around. Your fourth hint is that this entity can either hide behind something or be out in the open, meaning its difficulty can somewhat change depending on what version you get. Your final hint is that this entity is found in a sub-level, rather than in the main hotel. Have you figured out what this entity was? It's Vacuum. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity can only appear in a certain sub-level. This means that they cannot spawn in the normal hotel. Your second hint is that this entity is extremely common to encounter. In fact, I would say that they are the most common entity in the entire game, more common than Hide, who, may I remind you, appears in almost every single room. Your third hint is that this entity can spawn being multiple different sizes. Sometimes it can be big, and sometimes it can be small. It all depends on what stage they are in. Your fourth hint is that this entity can make a cameo in one of the many paintings around the hotel. Lastly, your final hint is that this entity was fan-made, meaning the developers of Doors didn't create it. Could you guess what this entity was? It's Greed. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity is extremely rare. Most players can complete multiple playthroughs of the game without ever interacting with it, and this could largely be chalked up to how it spawns. Your second hint is that this entity cannot kill you. However, if you manage to die to it through the use of exploits, your death overview will state you died to Unknown. Your third hint is that when this entity was first added, there were methods which guaranteed you to interact with it. Unfortunately, these have since been removed from the game. Your fourth hint is that this entity is confirmed to be non-canon to the story of Doors, which makes sense given their abilities. Your final hint is that this entity is the only entity which can appear in almost every single sublevel of the game. Could you guess what this entity was? It's Glitch. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity can spawn in every single room except the reception room, which is the very first room you can encounter in the hotel. Your second hint is that this entity only has a 3% chance to spawn in most rooms. However, in the dining room, they have a 1 in 1,650 chance of spawning, making them quite rare to appear in this area. Your third hint is that this entity is unable to attack players if another certain entity is present alongside it, and this feature was put into place to balance the game more so it isn't unfair. Your fourth hint is that this entity has an unused jump scare, and this is what it looks like. Your final hint is that this entity will always tend to appear near the correct exit door, so this means that you can use them to your advantage if they spawn alongside Dupe. Could you guess what this entity was? It's eyes. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity will be returning in Floor 2. Some entities, such as Screech, will be returning in the mines due to their abilities not necessarily having to be locked to just the hotel. Your second hint is that this entity can only spawn in a certain location. Some entities, such as Eyes, can spawn mostly wherever they want to, but this entity is locked to only one location. Your third hint is that this entity has a full name. Some entities, such as Rush, are only referred to as Rush. However, this entity canonically has a full name in addition to what they are typically referred to. Your fourth hint is that this entity has 2 badges associated with it. Most entities, such as Screech, have multiple badges which can be obtained by doing certain tasks with the entity, and this entity is no different. Your final hint is that this entity has blue eyes, and there are only a couple in the game with this trait. Could you figure out what this entity was? It's Jeff. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? This one will be a little tricky, so let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity can be affected by modifiers. Sometimes modifiers can be used to influence spawn rates and difficulties of certain entities, and this entity is no exception to that. Your second hint is that this entity can appear in the library. Some entities can appear alongside Figure in this area of the hotel, and this entity is one of those. Your third hint is that this entity cannot directly damage you. Some entities, such as Bob, are either helpful to the player or don't do anything at all, and this entity is one of those. Also, speaking of Bob, if you'd like to learn more about his lore and story, which is quite interesting, then I suggest you take a look at the video linked below. Moving on, your final hint is that this entity is confirmed to be coming back in Floor 2, aka the mines. Could you figure out what this entity was? It's Guiding Light. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity can only spawn in a certain sublevel. This means that it cannot appear in the main hotel. Your second hint is that this entity will deal 75 damage every time it hits you. Some entities, such as Screech, will only damage you when they attack rather than instantly killing you. However, this entity takes around 3/4 of your health away in a single blow. Your third hint is that this entity is a 3D model. Some entities, such as Glitch, are 3D models, whereas others, such as Ambush, are just 2D images. Your fourth hint is that this entity has increased spawn chances towards the end of their sublevel. An example of this would be like how Eyes will almost always spawn in the greenhouse area. Your final hint is that this entity has non-audio dialogue, similar to how El Goblino speaks with players. Could you figure out what this entity was? It's Jeff the Killer. Can you guess the Roblox store's entity based on the hints I give you? Let's find out. Your first hint is that this entity appears in one of the game's thumbnails. Multiple entities such as Rush appeared in these thumbnails, and this entity is no exception to that. Your second hint is that this entity can spawn in packs if the right conditions are met. An example of this would be how multiple eyes can spawn in the same room if you have the correct modifiers enabled. Your third hint is that this entity was not created by the developers of Doors. Some entities, such as Greed, were fan-made, and they just happened to be added to the game, and this entity is one of those. Your fourth hint is that this entity's spawning mechanics are linked to the in-game time. An example of this would be how Dread can only spawn if the in-game time is midnight. Lastly, your final hint is that this entity is red in color, and only a few in-game have this trait. Could you figure out what this entity was? It's the Draco Bloxer from the April Fool's 2024 event.